He was the heir to a throne he would never rule, a child born to unimaginable privilege, yet condemned to an equally unimaginable fate. Don Carlos of Spain, son of Philip II, was once hailed as the bright flame of the Spanish Habsburgs, a dynasty drowning in its own power and fears. But behind the fortress walls of Spanish grandeur, a slow, gnawing horror unfolded, a prince consumed from the inside, not only by disease but by betrayal, paranoia, and a terrible darkness that no one dared name aloud. The boy who should have been a king became a prisoner, and finally, a wretched sacrifice upon the altar of an empire's survival. Spain in the mid-16th century stood at the pinnacle of its imperial might. The golden empire of Charles V had passed to his son, Philip II, whose vast dominions stretched from Flanders to the New World, bound together by a sense of divine mission as much as by cold steel. Yet behind these triumphs lurked the dread of dynastic weakness. The Habsburg line, famed for its centuries of inbreeding, bore hidden cracks in its marble. In 1545, Don Carlos was born into this dynasty as the only son of Prince Philip and Maria of Portugal. His mother died within days of his birth, leaving the infant prince an orphaned heir before he had drawn more than a few breaths. From his earliest years, Carlos seemed to carry within him the doom of his line. Reports from his childhood described a sickly, strangely deformed boy, his head misshapen, his jaw jutting forward, his limbs stiff and awkward. Courtiers whispered of his twisted spine and volatile temper, but they dared not question his place in the succession. This boy was the future of Spain, even if nature itself seemed to resist the idea. And so, tutors and physicians alike labored to shape him into something a king might be, or at least, something that could appear one. Carlos's education was entrusted to the best scholars in Spain, but all their lessons could not soothe his monstrous rages. He was willful, cruel, and dangerously unpredictable, lashing out at servants, harming animals, even threatening to kill those closest to him. Accounts tell of a boy obsessed with violent games, with torturing birds, or even with drawing knives on his tutors. Some saw only a spoiled, unloved child abandoned by a mother who died too soon. Others saw something far darker, a young prince possessed by a bottomless malice that no discipline could correct. As Carlos grew, so did the pressures upon him. In 1556, Philip II inherited the Spanish crown from Charles V and set out to solidify his power. But to secure the future, he needed an heir who would rule with confidence and grace, qualities Carlos seemed to lack entirely. And so the child king-in-waiting became a living embarrassment, a source of dread. His father, already weighed down by the responsibilities of empire, watched with a cold and measuring eye as his son became a man in name only, unable to control his impulses or even to protect his own reputation. At 16, Carlos suffered a terrible head injury after tumbling down a flight of stairs. His skull had to be trepanned, a gruesome surgery to drill holes into the bone to relieve swelling and save his life. Though he survived, he was never the same. The already unpredictable prince now raged more violently than ever, consumed by headaches, paranoia, and a frightening obsession with death. Some chroniclers even claimed that after this injury, Carlos believed himself invincible, or worse, believed God had chosen him to punish the world. The rumors spread like wildfire, staining the prince's name across the Spanish court. Still, he was the heir, and there was no other. Philip II, ever the austere king and devoted Catholic, felt bound by duty to preserve his son's status. But in secret, he and his advisors began to wonder if Carlos might someday destroy them all. The empire trembled under its own impossible weight. An ocean of gold flowing from the Americas, a continent locked in religious war, enemies on all sides. If the next king was mad, who would hold the Spanish crown together? Tensions reached a breaking point in 1567, when Philip II sent his brutal general, the Duke of Alba, to suppress revolt in the Netherlands. Carlos, seeing the war as a chance for personal glory, demanded to lead the campaign. The king refused. His son was too unstable, too violent, too unpredictable to trust with an army. Carlos's rage boiled over into outright treason. He tried to escape the palace, to join the Dutch rebels instead. In the eyes of the Spanish monarchy, this was unforgivable. The empire could forgive a deformed heir, It could even forgive a cruel, unstable youth, but it could never forgive betrayal. One winter night in 1568, guards seized Don Carlos in his chambers. They dragged him, screaming and raving, into the darkness, where iron bolts slammed shut on his destiny. The once promised heir of Spain was now its prisoner, entombed within his father's fortress. And the horror had only just begun. The silence of the royal fortress swallowed Don Carlos whole, yet the echoes of his rage and despair reached far beyond its stone walls. Philip II, ever the calculating monarch, justified the arrest with careful proclamations to his advisors. The prince was a danger to himself, to the royal family, and to the empire. In the unforgiving logic of Habsburg politics, no crime was worse than endangering the dynasty itself. But behind these official justifications lay a far darker, more personal truth. For Philip, Carlos had become a living curse, a son whose very existence threatened to unravel the carefully constructed fabric of Spanish power, a malformed and uncontrollable reminder of everything the dynasty feared in its own bloodline. Carlos was confined under a regime of relentless, almost ritualistic isolation. His rooms were stripped of sharp objects, his windows shuttered, his contact with the outside world cut to almost nothing. Armed guards kept watch day and night, peering through hidden peepholes to ensure the prince did not harm himself or attempt another escape. Meals were rationed and examined, visitors tightly controlled, and physicians summoned only when absolutely necessary. In these suffocating conditions, Don Carlos began to deteriorate with terrifying speed. His mind, already tormented by suspicion and violence, sank deeper into madness. He refused food for days at a time, then suddenly gorged himself until vomiting. He wept for hours, then fell into paroxysms of savage fury, tearing apart furniture or throwing himself at the walls like a beast. He accused his father of poisoning him, accused his guards of plotting to suffocate him in his sleep, and sometimes, in moments of pitiful lucidity, he begged for mercy, pleading to see his stepmother, Queen Isabel, or any living soul who might remind him of life beyond these pitiless walls. Rumors began to swirl among the Spanish people. Had the king murdered his own son? Was the heir to the throne still alive, or had he already been quietly disposed of? Chroniclers recorded that even within Philip's council, many men grew uneasy at the spectacle of a royal heir reduced to a caged animal. And yet, the king would not relent. For Philip, any risk of Carlos regaining freedom was intolerable. The memory of the prince's attempted flight to the Netherlands burned like a brand on the king's conscience, a warning that this boy could still ignite revolt if ever he slipped through the bars again. The horror of Carlos's decline did not unfold overnight. For half a year he endured this living death, cut off from family, stripped of every comfort except his own festering mind. His health collapsed. Witnesses described a stinking, feverish youth whose flesh began to rot before their eyes. Boils erupted on his legs. Ulcers festered on his skin. His hair fell out in greasy clumps. His gums swelled. His teeth turned black. In this prison, Carlos was truly being eaten from the inside, consumed by infection, starvation, and the bottomless terror of his own nightmares. At times, the prince was forced to sleep naked, as his clothes had grown so rank with sweat and filth they could no longer be laundered. Servants, fearing his violent rages, tried to clean him with long-handled sponges rather than approach him directly. And all the while, the stench of decay grew stronger, an unholy scent that made even the hardened guards retch as they passed his door. In a world obsessed with royal dignity, the heir of Spain had become a living corpse. Yet Philip did not order his death outright. In some twisted sense of duty, the king insisted his son must not be executed, but simply restrained until God decided his fate. The cruelty of this reasoning is staggering. A slow and humiliating death behind locked doors, under the watchful gaze of men who were commanded to let him die naturally, no matter how hideous that death might become. Even in this pit of degradation, Carlos's rage found ways to flare. He struck at guards, smashed cups against the walls, demanded wine in monstrous quantities, and tried to starve himself only to break down and beg for scraps hours later. There were stories of him trying to eat candles, raw meat, anything to fill the agony in his belly. His bones began to show through his skin. At night, the fortress echoed with his screams, a symphony of torment that made even veteran soldiers shudder. As word of the prince's condition began to leak, Philip grew ever more determined to keep him silenced. Trusted clerics were brought in to minister to the dying boy, urging him to confess his sins and make peace with God. But Carlos refused. He lashed out with curses, called them devils, accused them of being the king's poisoners. Each prayer they offered fell upon a soul broken past all saving. In July of 1568, 6 months after he was imprisoned, the twisted finale arrived. Carlos's body, worn away by infection and neglect, could endure no more. Fever burned through him like wildfire, and his skin turned the color of ashes. Witnesses described him gasping for breath, fighting to stay conscious as his lungs filled with fluid. Some said he cried out for his mother, long dead, as though even in delirium he reached for the one comfort he had never truly known. By nightfall, the heir of Spain was dead. The fortress fell into a dreadful hush as his corpse, shriveled and gray, was carried away for burial. The boy who was born to rule an empire had perished in a locked room, gnawed away by the very dynasty he was meant to continue. The death of Don Carlos should have ended a chapter of horror, yet it opened a new wound in the heart of the Spanish monarchy. As the news filtered through the palace and beyond its walls, shock mingled with disbelief. The heir to the greatest empire in Europe had died alone, in filth and madness, while his father still sat upon the throne. Whispers erupted almost immediately, spreading across the courts of Europe like a plague. Had Philip II ordered his son's murder? Was the death truly natural, or a subtle assassination cloaked in religious language and dynastic duty? Philip, master of appearances, wasted no time moving to silence such rumors. A carefully orchestrated funeral took place, with all the solemn pageantry expected of a Habsburg prince. Bells tolled for hours, masses were sung for the salvation of Don Carlos's soul, and richly robed clergy moved through the chapel like silent shadows. Official proclamations stressed that the prince had died of natural causes of illness, weakness, and his own excesses. Yet for many who had heard the screams in the night or smelled the rot of his prison cell, these official words rang hollow. The Spanish people themselves were left uneasy. Their prince had been no hero, certainly, but he was still of their blood, their future king. The spectacle of a father imprisoning his own son and letting him die without trial unsettled the deepest roots of loyalty. In Madrid's taverns and marketplaces, storytellers spun darker tales, that the king had feared being overthrown by his mad son, that he had ordered poison slipped into the boy's cup, that Don Carlos had been suffocated at night by guards on Philip's command. The truth that the prince had rotted alive under lock and key seemed almost too monstrous to believe, yet it was exactly what had happened. Across Europe, enemies of Spain seized on the scandal. Protestant pamphleteers in the Netherlands published lurid accusations, portraying Philip II as a tyrant and religious fanatic who had murdered his own child. French writers joined in, painting the Spanish king as a cruel autocrat whose own son had begged for mercy in vain. The Dutch rebels, seeking to justify their revolt, held up the fate of Don Carlos as proof that Spain's rulers were inhuman, prepared to crush anyone, even family, in the name of power. Philip, for his part, responded with unflinching calm. He had rid himself of a dangerous heir, an heir who might have shattered Spain's fragile hold on Europe. In private, however, even this cold and calculating king must have felt a tremor of fear. He had destroyed his own son, the very child he had once held up as Spain's future. Could God forgive such an act? Could the dynasty survive with its lines so violently broken? These questions would haunt Philip to the end of his reign. For the court, there was no time to grieve. A new heir had to be established, the stability of the monarchy reaffirmed before the great machine of empire could grind to a halt. Philip soon married again and sired another son, who would become Philip III. The machinery of royal succession clicked forward as though Don Carlos had never existed, erasing his memory almost overnight. Paintings were removed, documents quietly altered, and songs praising the young prince's birth were left to rot in archives. Official histories gave only a curt mention of his unfortunate passing, drawing a veil of silence across the horror. But memory is not so easily buried. For those who had served Carlos, who had watched him grow from a fragile, sickly boy to a raving prisoner, the trauma ran deep. Some servants fled the court, unable to bear the whispers of their complicity. Others spoke in hushed voices of what they had seen, the sores on the prince's body, the madness in his eyes, the stench of a living corpse rotting by inches behind a locked door. They remembered how he had screamed, night after night, for help that never came. It was as though Spain itself wished to swallow up the evidence of what had been done. Chroniclers who recorded the truth did so carefully, mindful of the Inquisition's watchful eye and the king's fury. But even then, the story would not die. Over decades and centuries, the tale of Don Carlos re-emerged, each telling reshaping him as victim or monster, martyr or madman. The poets and playwrights of Europe found in him a perfect, tragic figure, the broken heir imprisoned by his own father, crushed by a merciless empire. And in this image, Don Carlos achieved the legacy he never could have claimed in life. He became a symbol of royal cruelty and the terrible price of dynastic ambition. His story was a warning of what happens when power devours its own children, when the preservation of a crown outweighs the bonds of blood. Yet even these later retellings could not fully capture the horror of those final days. The stifling heat of a Spanish summer, the unwashed walls of the fortress, the shrieks in the night, these details belong to a reality so grim it defies even the darkest legends. The boy who would be king was consumed not only by disease and madness, but by a world that had no place for weakness, no mercy for failure, and no patience for a broken heir who could not carry the crushing weight of empire. In the end, Carlos was as much a victim of history as of his own monstrous nature. An empire built on conquest and faith could tolerate anything except instability. And so he died, locked away, forgotten, his flesh eaten by rot, his mind shattered beyond recall. Even in death, Don Carlos refused to rest quietly in the chronicles of Europe. His tragic tale echoed through the 17th century, seizing the imaginations of poets, playwrights, and propagandists alike. Each age found a new way to interpret his fall, shaping him into a tragic hero, a monstrous madman, or a cautionary ghost. It was as if the world could not look away from the image of a prince devoured by the very institution that birthed him. In many ways, Don Carlos was transformed into a symbol of the Habsburg dynasty's greatest fear, that their own bloodline, so carefully protected and obsessively controlled, carried a fatal flaw that would someday bring the whole empire crashing down. One of the most powerful retellings came from Friedrich Schiller, whose 1787 play Don Carlos made the prince a tragic freedom fighter, a young idealist who dared to resist his father's tyranny. In Schiller's hands, Carlos became a martyr of liberty, a victim of absolutism's suffocating grip. Schiller's play fired the imaginations of revolutionaries across Europe, giving new life to the prince's otherwise pitiful memory. The true Don Carlos, disfigured, ill-tempered, and half-mad, was forgotten in favor of this tragic hero who died for noble ideals. The dramatists of Spain, more loyal to the Catholic monarchy, took a different view. They painted Carlos as a cautionary lesson about disobedience and sin, a prince whose own vices brought him low, whose corruption had to be purged by his father to save the realm. These two competing images, one of the martyred prince, one of the cursed monster, battled for centuries over his legacy, shaping public memory far beyond any actual facts. But if you peel away the centuries of propaganda, a simpler, darker truth emerges. Carlos was a child of incestuous dynastic ambition, carrying a genetic burden too heavy for one body to bear. His disfigured skull, his fragile health, his bursts of irrational violence, all were symptoms of a line grown dangerously narrow, of royal bloodlines that had tangled too tightly over too many generations. His mother, Maria of Portugal, was his cousin. His father, Philip II, was descended from multiple intermarriages in the Habsburg clan. These were marriages meant to protect empire, but they had sown the seeds of decay instead. Carlos was that decay made flesh. From the moment he was born, Carlos was never truly free. Every gesture he made was scrutinized, every word weighed, every emotion calculated for what it might mean for the empire. Even his education was a weapon, a constant struggle to mold him into a prince worthy of Spain's grandeur. And when he could not measure up, the same dynasty that had created him decided he had to be locked away, that his destruction was a kind of purification for the royal bloodline. In this, Carlos was not just a victim of political maneuvering, he was a victim of a monstrous idea, the belief that a dynasty could bend nature itself to its will. No amount of gold from the Americas, no triumphs in battle, no mass conversions of souls could truly protect Spain from that one terrible truth. Its future rested on the shoulders of a broken boy. And the world watched as the Habsburgs tried to hide that truth, as they buried it behind iron doors and priests' prayers, as if shame alone could cleanse their dynasty. Yet the echoes of Carlos's screams could not be silenced. For the common people of Spain, Don Carlos's death became an unspoken horror, a reminder that the powerful were capable of devouring their own in the name of order. Generations later, peasants still whispered about the prince who rotted behind castle walls, warning their children that even kings' sons could become prisoners if they strayed too far from a father's command. In a culture built on absolute loyalty, Don Carlos was a living nightmare, proof that not even blood could guarantee mercy. Meanwhile, Philip II carried on his rule as though nothing had happened. He continued his battles against Protestant rebels, expanded Spain's colonial reach, and strengthened his alliance with the Catholic Church. Historians would record his reign as one of iron devotion to faith and empire, but behind those triumphs stood the silent corpse of his son. It was a corpse that would haunt him, if not in waking life, then in the restless hours of night when the shrieks of a doomed child might return in dreams. Some would say that Spain itself began to rot from within after Carlos's death, that the empire's great age of power was slowly eaten away by the same fear, paranoia, and brutality that had claimed its prince. In the decades that followed, the Spanish crown faced rebellion after rebellion, crushing debt, and humiliating defeats on the battlefield. It was as though the sacrifice of Don Carlos had not appeased the gods of empire but had instead cursed them, leaving behind a stain that no prayer or ritual could cleanse. The fortress where Carlos died eventually fell silent, its walls a mute witness to the most terrible chapter in the Habsburg family drama. But the story of the boy king devoured from within refused to die, lingering like a ghost across Europe's imagination, ready to be revived whenever another tyrant threatened his own children in the name of power. Centuries later, historians would return to the archives, piecing together the scraps of testimony left behind by priests, guards, and horrified servants to reconstruct the final months of Don Carlos's life. What emerged was not the tale of a hero or a pure villain, but a deeply human tragedy. A young man, twisted by inherited flaws, torn apart by dynastic obsession, and abandoned by the very father who should have protected him. The evidence told of a child left to wither behind locked doors, too dangerous to free yet too sacred to kill openly, a creature suspended between royal duty and mortal horror. Modern medicine has since offered its own explanations for the boy's monstrous decline. The strange swelling of his skull, the deformed jaw, the stunted growth, the sudden explosions of violence, these could all have been symptoms of congenital hydrocephalus, worsened by the Habsburg tradition of intermarriage. Others have suggested epilepsy, or even some unidentified neurodegenerative disorder fed by malnutrition and stress. Yet no diagnosis could undo the tragedy that unfolded. It hardly mattered what had caused his illness. What mattered was how he had been treated, first as a living heir to be trained like a war horse, then as a dangerous beast to be chained and left to die. The Spanish chronicles of the time struggled to keep the story under control. Official accounts insisted that Don Carlos had been gently imprisoned, cared for with great caution and respect. But personal letters, scribbled reports from frightened monks, and the reluctant confessions of witnesses painted a far grimmer scene. The prince, once heir to a global empire, had lived out his last months in filth, half-starved, crawling across the flagstones of his cell, clawing at the walls, screaming until his voice broke. He had begged for wine, water, bread, anything while the guards feared to get too close, worried he would scratch or bite them like a mad dog. And even as he decayed, the machinery of empire moved forward, refusing to stop for a broken child. Ambassadors came and went, priests debated doctrine, soldiers marched to foreign wars, all while a royal heir was left to rot in a stone tomb, barely 100 paces from his father's study. This was Spain in its moment of absolute triumph, conquering the Americas, battling across Europe, and yet so terrified of its own blood that it imprisoned its future rather than risk imperfection on the throne. What stands out even now, across the centuries, is the monstrous patience of it all. There was no rush to kill Don Carlos, no dagger in the dark, no poisoned cup, though some would always suspect these. Instead, there was a systematic starvation, a withholding of comfort, an almost religious ritual of slow death. Guards did not beat him. They simply let him decay, watched as he refused food, then gave him just enough to keep him alive until the next round of fevers could batter him again. Day by day, inch by inch, his life was peeled away, until nothing remained but the wreck of a human being, consumed by his own failing flesh and a father's pitiless decision. This horror did not stay hidden. Visitors to the court, even those who never glimpsed the prince, heard the rumors. Letters to Italy, to France, to the German states carried hints of the boy's decline, wrapped in the language of courtly caution. Words like melancholy, illness, unsettled mind became a code for the nightmare behind the fortress walls, and each letter carried with it a quiet terror. If this was how Spain treated its heir, what might it do to lesser men? For the Spanish monarchy, the death of Carlos became a problem to manage rather than a sorrow to mourn. They buried him quickly, surrounded by priests and grand ceremony, hoping to drown out any doubts with a chorus of prayers. Chroniclers were paid to note his pious acceptance of God's will, ignoring the months of raving that had preceded his final collapse. The fortress was cleaned, the cells repainted, and the king turned his eyes to the future, to new alliances, new conquests, new heirs who might carry the dynasty's torch more safely. Yet the world would not let them forget. In Protestant strongholds, pamphlets poured out describing Carlos as a holy martyr crushed by an evil father, a youth whose only crime was to challenge the tyranny of Catholic rule. In Spain, poets dared to hint at darker truths in coded verses, describing the shadow of a king's child who wept behind closed doors. Even centuries later, artists and novelists would find new inspiration in the haunting story of a boy who was devoured alive by the relentless machine of empire. And in those retellings, something universal was revealed, a warning about power that cares nothing for love, about dynasties that devour their young in the name of perfection. The horror of Don Carlos was not just about one father and one son, but about every system that values its own preservation above the simple bonds of mercy. Spain, in its triumph, had revealed a crack in its soul, a willingness to sacrifice even its children if they could not measure up to its impossible dreams. This, perhaps more than any rebellion or invasion, was what truly haunted Europe, the realization that beneath all the banners and prayers and gold, something deeply rotten had taken root in the Spanish heart. And it had begun terribly and unmistakably with a boy who should have been king. In the years that followed, the ghost of Don Carlos would never quite fade. Like a wound that refused to heal, his story reappeared whenever Spain's might seemed unassailable. Enemies would invoke the name of the prince left to rot behind bars as a symbol of the empire's hidden rot, a reminder that all its conquests and Catholic triumphs could not conceal the crimes it had committed against its own blood. For Spain itself, the memory became something darker still, a silent acknowledgement that absolute rule, so proudly defended by Philip II, could consume more than just rebels and heretics. It could devour its own children. Some historians in later centuries tried to absolve Philip II, arguing that Carlos was so violently unstable that the king had no other choice but to lock him away. They cited the prince's brutal rages, the threat of treason, the risk he posed to an already fragile realm. These historians saw Philip as a tragic father forced to do the unthinkable for the good of a kingdom in chaos, and perhaps there was some truth in that. Perhaps Carlos truly was too dangerous to rule. But what none of these arguments can erase is the horror of the method, a slow, systematic, and excruciating death, permitted and even planned by his own father. To many across Europe, that was a crime worse than simple regicide. It was a moral fracture at the very heart of monarchy, an act of unnatural cruelty that poisoned the idea of divine kingship. If a king could imprison and starve his own heir, then what hope had any subject of mercy? It was a question that would hang over the Spanish monarchy for generations, long after Philip's own bones had turned to dust. In the decades after Carlos's death, Spain's power began to fade. The endless wars, the crushing debts, the strain of holding a global empire together These forces all converged to break Spain's back. The Habsburg line, so fixated on protecting itself through carefully arranged marriages, would collapse under the same genetic weaknesses that had doomed Carlos. Infertility, madness, and disease ran through the dynasty like poison in a well, until there were no healthy heirs left to claim the Spanish crown. In that way, Carlos's fate was not a strange accident, but an omen. He was the first loud signal that the Habsburg dynasty was devouring itself, strangled by its own ambitions and its own fear of change. It is almost as if Spain had performed a ritual sacrifice on its own future, trying to cleanse its fears with the death of a prince, only to find the rot had spread too deeply to be cut out. Over time, the tale of Don Carlos transformed into myth, then legend, then a convenient cautionary story. Artists painted him with wild eyes, broken chains, and outstretched hands, trapped in a dark cell that stood in for all the dungeons of human tyranny. Playwrights and opera composers, most famously Verdi in his Don Carlo, reimagined him as a doomed lover, a tragic rebel who fought for freedom and died betrayed. Even centuries later, the flickering candle of his story refused to go out, because it revealed a universal fear that the systems we build to protect us can, in their paranoia, become our executioners. Today, historians continue to debate what really killed Don Carlos. Was it a hidden poison, slipped quietly into his cup by order of Philip? Was it starvation, infection, madness, or some combination of all three? Perhaps we will never know the precise cause. The official records were written by men desperate to protect the crown, and the truth was lost behind layers of ritual and political caution. What no one disputes is the cruelty of those final months, a cruelty that seems to echo in every retelling. The fortress where he died still stands, its walls a grim monument to a chapter Spain has never fully accepted. Tour guides gesture to its towers, whispering that somewhere behind those stones a prince once screamed through the night, only to be met with silence. Even in the 21st century, visitors feel a chill when they step through those gates, as if the spirit of a boy betrayed still lingers, searching for justice that will never come. In the end, Don Carlos's tragedy is less about the madness of a single prince and more about the madness of empire itself, an empire that feared weakness so completely that it chose to bury its own future rather than risk the shame of an imperfect king, an empire so certain of its divine mission that it crushed the humanity of its own heir. As history moves forward, his story stands as a mirror, reflecting back a terrifying question: how far will a powerful system go to preserve itself? If kings can devour their sons, what hope is there for the rest of us? It is a question that should haunt every generation, a question that refuses to die, just like the memory of the boy who would have been king. If you have thoughts or reflections on this harrowing tale, share them below, because some stories must be remembered, no matter how dark.